Everyone. Again, welcome, and thank you, Jennifer, and everyone. Thanks for joining Lowell Lab Boston's third annual Flash Talks. This evening's program is the result of looking back at 2020 and all of the acute changes we faced, from global warming to political and social disruption, income inequality, healthcare, and peace. And none of these topics can stand on their own. And the question is where to start. With that, we brought together who I think are four amazing big picture thinkers to help us understand the intersectionality of it all through their own particular lenses. Before we get started, I just want to let you know how the evening will roll out. The first 40 minutes will be dedicated to each presenter. Each will begin with a short video introduction that will be followed by a 5-minute presentation with a question or two from me or George Gantz. We'll then go into the next presenter. After everyone's spoken, we'll bring the presenters back for a panel. Field questions from the audience, so please, if you have questions at any time, please put those into the chat, which we'll be monitoring during the evening, so keep those cards and letters coming in. That formal part of the evening will wrap around 8:10, and then we encourage all to head down to the virtual Shy Bird Bar in the lobby for a post-event open mic conversation until around 8:30. So I think that's everything, and it's my honor now to introduce Joe Levine to this long now conversation. Joe is a dear friend. He's a biologist, educator. He's dedicated to the public understanding of science. He co-authors the most widely used high school biology textbook in the United States and is recognized internationally for championing evolution and climate change education. His media credits as science advisor and producer include, among others, NPR, Nova, and the Discovery Channel. He's been all around the world working as training educators. And Gary, if you can, let's roll his video.
Hi, I'm Joe Levine. I'm a biologist and educator. I've been working broadly in science education now for 30 plus years. Yeah, there are a couple of levels on which this material is important to me. One of them is the sort of pure intellectual level. Another is a practical level in the short term. In other words, we're seeing sea level rise combined with stronger storms that's causing damage. And as a scientist who has some understanding of that and is in regular conversation with people who are actually doing the research, I feel it's important to get that information out now. In addition to that, there is the realization that in terms of our planet's lifetime, in terms of deep time going back to the beginnings of life and the formation of the planet and all that, we're, a millisecond so far here. And we hope that the history of humans on the planet goes further into the future. And it would be nice if we could set things up and do our best to make sure that there's a deep time going forward too. That it's not just my son, Isaac, that it's not just his kids, if and when they ever arrive. It is for humanity in perpetuity. Certainly having a child who is now no longer a child, but a young man, I feel very strongly a sense of responsibility to try and set our social systems, our political systems, on a better trajectory towards sustainability, because otherwise things are going to start falling apart. And it's not going to happen overnight. It's not like some of the apocalyptic movies like Day After Tomorrow or Snowpiercer or something like that. It's not going to be Saturday, it's normal, and Sunday there's a giant frozen tidal wave engulfing New York City. That's not going to happen. It's a slow incremental process. And I think the biggest challenge we have is getting the general public to recognize the value of scientific information in charting not just their daily lives, but in planning for the future for their kids. Not just that they encourage their kids to start a 401k, but that they themselves and their kids are involved in projects that are aimed at sustaining our species on the planet.
Joe, well, thanks very much. And we'd like to welcome you here to Long Now Boston. One of the things that you and I have been talking about a lot is this whole intersectionality, and not only about climate change, but as you've been saying, global change, and what language is there to speak about that. That it's not, we need a language for it. So I know you've been working on that. Would you share that with us, please?
Sure, I'd be very happy to. Good evening, everyone, and it's a pleasure to be here addressing you. I am eager to talk about this project and try and see how it might overlap with some of the concerns that are going to be expressed by the other speakers. So to start off with, I think it's best that you don't look at me during this time, so I will share a presentation that I have prepared. So at the beginning here, this is the cover of Nature magazine from an issue about a year and a half ago, and it directly addresses one of the themes of Long Now, being a good ancestor, and that one of the world's two premier scientific journals has this question right up front: what kind of world will we pass on? Indicates the importance of the scientific community's participation in trying to answer that question. I think a very good place to start is realizing that this planet that we're on, although it seems incredibly large to most of us, is actually just a tiny piece of dirt floating in the vastness of space. And the reason that we're all living on it is because it functions something like a spaceship. It has all sorts of systems of global size with local operations that keep things moving in ways that support life. And the question is, what are we as humans doing in terms of participating? It turns out that in the last 60, 70 years, we have been transformed from passengers on spaceship Earth to the crew. The problem is that as crew, we have no operating manual. And in order to understand how the spaceship operates, we need to first be able to understand how global systems work and what the characteristics of those systems are and what causes changes in their function. So I've been working with a group of people from the UC Berkeley Museum of Paleontology for about 10 years now on trying to come up with a conceptual framework to let us wrap our heads around what we're dealing with in terms of our planetary support systems. And after many iterations, we came up with what we think is the simplest possible representation of this incredibly complex system. So we start off with a ring that represents global systems. We then add outside of that ring another ring which represents causes of global change, phenomena that affect the functioning of global systems. And then inside, we put measurable changes in global systems because the causes of change affect the functions of the system and cause changes in those systems. Then we note that this system operates in 4 major areas: atmosphere, hydrosphere, geosphere, and biosphere. And then we created this system of icons to represent different groups of human activities. And in part because of the way people are going to be speaking later, I want to point out that none of these are unitary phenomena. Agricultural activities are enormously diverse and complicated. Each of these represents a whole plethora of different activities and phenomena. And because we had an advisory board that consisted of 14 academics from UC Berkeley, we ended up with 82 of these icons distributed across our system. And I encourage you to come back and look at this presentation when it's not being rushed in 5 minutes and sort of see what goes on here. What I would like to point out, especially given Long Now's focus and the focus of later speakers, is that at the center of this system, we have human well-being, effects on human populations, health and disease, food ability and nutrition, displacement, air quality, fresh water quality, and availability. The other thing that these icons enable us to do is they enable us to make useful heuristic collections of ideas. so that we can see here very simply that climate is not just temperature. That's why we don't just talk about global warming. Climate is clouds, wind, precipitation, temperature, and weather and extreme events. In our chart, this is represented in this area of our circular diagrams, climate in the global systems, and in measurable changes, all these other aspects. So when we say climate change, we mean a lot more than warming. We mean changes in all these aspects. The other thing the system enables us to do is to take a system like coronaviruses and pandemics and try and imagine how these things are connected. What creates the situation that enables and drives pandemics? We have human population growth, agricultural activities, deforestation, reforestation, urbanization, fishing and hunting. All of these affect the functioning of ecosystems in various parts of the world. And the ecosystems affect populations of species, species ranges, habitat loss, species interactions, and all of those have impacts on human health and disease. And all of those have interactions. So to finish up, almost on time, ending up with a mandala drawn by an artist friend of mine from Bali, reminding us that at the center of all of what's going on in the world, of course, the Hindu mythology is that the world sits on the back of a turtle, is Saraswati, the goddess of art, music, learning, and culture. And that's what we're trying to do here. Thank you very much.
Joe, just a quick question. This is an amazing project. I remember when I first looked at that chart, the first thing, it just fascinated me because the center was about mindfulness, basically. It just came down to us. What kind of follow-through are you seeing in getting this new language out to educators around the world and researchers, and also being able to crunch data from that exists through all these different places?
Yeah.
In about a minute, Joe.
So far, this is exclusively qualitative. What we're just trying to do is map and chart the kinds of interactions that occur among these different parts of the conceptual framework. It desperately needs quantification. There are people who are working on very small pieces of that, very small and very important pieces of that, and we have not yet incorporated that into the framework. The primary focus now is on establishing it and correlating it with educational standards in this country, because that's what drives public education. So we have people working to make sure that every state in the country, that their standards are reflected in some part of this framework so that teachers will teach it. And for my personal part in this, I have restructured the entire ecology unit of our most recent edition of the textbook completely around this conceptual framework. And it provides a much more satisfactory way of wrapping up the story, because instead of a bullet list of ways we're taking Earth to hell in a handbasket, it provides this framework that we can see how different things we're doing are interacting.
But you already took Earth to hell in a handbasket with the whole creationism conversation in Texas a few years ago.
Right. I remember fondly a couple of decades ago when we were under the assumption that the most serious issue with public understanding versus denial of science was evolution creationism. Little did we know where we would be in 2021.
Well, let's hopefully, 2021 is going to be better than 2020. Thank you. I'm going to hand off now to George, who is going to introduce Eleanor.
All right, thank you, Kim. Just confirming you can hear me. Can you nod up and down? Okay, I'm on, great. Thanks, Kim. I have the great pleasure of introducing our second Flash Talk speaker tonight, Eleanor Murphy. Eleanor is the Director of Philanthropy and Engagement with Acumen. Acumen helps diverse stakeholders at the local level to develop leaders and to scale social enterprises tackling some of the world's toughest problems, from gender inequity to sustainable asset pathways to clean water. Collaboration and partnership are core to her work, which is what makes it fun. Eleanor also had joined us as a speaker with Long Now Boston Conversation in June 2019 on innovations to eradicate global poverty, which is a great session. So let's hear Eleanor's opening video.
My name is Eleanor Murphy. I'm the Director of Philanthropy and Engagement for Acumen. My passion really is about repurposing existing tools to work towards solving some of the world's biggest problems. When I say that, I mean the problems of poverty, limited access to energy, education, healthcare, financial inclusion, services that for so many of us in the developed world take for granted or we are privileged to have at our fingertips. So many of these challenges have been long-standing, and we really hadn't solved the problems, and they kind of continue to perpetuate themselves. And so what I was looking for was something that was innovative, different, a different approach, and that's how I came across Acumen. For a number of the regions where we work at Acumen, markets don't exist. There's no leverage within a market. These are private, illiquid markets essentially. And so the idea is to, over time, this isn't 10 years, 20 years, or 50 years, it's hundreds of years. You can build a swath of social enterprises that then facilitate the creation of a market. So they facilitate bringing in other stakeholders, bringing government along, building competitive landscapes so that these businesses can thrive. And that's where you see the breadth of impact that we're looking for. So it's a long-term play. The issue for me that is most pressing is climate change, our environment. And I think there is some intersectionality with poverty. Of course, the poor people of the world are feeling the impacts of climate change more so than anyone while contributing the least. But we also see real solution there, where we're working to improve the incomes of smallholder farmers, but at the same time, give back to the earth, regenerate the soil, be less extractive, put less CO2 into the air. So really ways that I think solve two of the world's biggest problems. Again, poverty, and 80% of the world's poor work with either directly or indirectly in the agriculture space for their incomes. And so we can attack this issue, again, twofold, by increasing the incomes of farmers with these really innovative social enterprises that are coming up with new technologies, new methodologies, farming techniques, aggregators to connect smallholder farmers to the global markets, or local markets for that matter, but then building in these practices of regeneration. And so I think that's one of the most exciting areas, I think, from where I sit, because I think about the world at large as well in the long term, 50, 100 years down the line, where relying on the produce, the product, the outputs of smallholder farmers is going to become more and more important as the population grows and increases in size drastically over the next 10, 15, 20 years. And so by building these practices into, to stabilize smallholder farmer incomes, but also getting to a point where they can produce more consistent quality product and produce, then we see the capacity to connect the dots from large corporations, us in the Western world, to smallholder farmers. And again, regenerating the earth at the same time. That to me feels like one of the best innovations and where we should be doubling down.
All right, Eleanor, thank you. That was an excellent opening video, and I love the way you've got the intersectionality going on well. So I want to welcome you again to Long Now Boston. Thanks for joining us. And I want to kind of bring this conversation forward by observing that you work in a sector that suffers most in periods of disruption, like the one we're experiencing now. And I'm hoping you can share some of what you see that gives hope for the future. So love to hear what you have to say.
Sure, thanks, George. And again, thank you for inviting me back. And I'm delighted to be with the Long Now community again. And I'd love to share what gives me hope, because I'm certainly hopeful, even amidst this current disruption that we're living through. And one of my favorite sayings, I think I shared it last time, is the most radical thing you can do in the time of despair is to be hopeful. But again, what I focus on are the world's toughest problems, at least in our framing, and that's really focused on poverty. And not just simply poverty as a measure of income, but it's multi-layers. It's many dimensions of poverty, the different ways in which it's measured, the diverse contributing stakeholders actually at play. So we have $3.10 per day as the global poverty line. There's gender inequality that adds a layer on top of that. There are institutions that aren't working, that continue to maintain the barriers that keep the poor impoverished, limited access to basic goods and services, lack of empathy, essentially, within our leadership across the globe. And all of these are very interconnected, right? In a matrix kind of nuanced way that make the idea of tackling poverty almost overwhelming. But again, that's where I see hope for humanity in the long term, because of the innovations that are being deployed across the globe that are taking on these challenges. And so I spoke about the climate crisis, which of course, in addition to the current state of COVID-19, they're both deeply connected to poverty. Because again, as I mentioned, most of the world's poor are relying on agriculture and living off of the land, which has been extremely hard hit because of our changing climate. We're all witnessing its force and its fury, and it's a living reality for the world's poor, almost more so for the rest of us. Not just a headline or a political agenda, but literally impacting their ability to provide the basic needs for their families. These extreme weather patterns are causing epic precipitation, drastic droughts, and for smallholder farmers across the globe who don't have the technologies or knowledge to manage and adapt to these changes, their livelihoods are on the line. In developed countries and developing countries alike, homes, food security, health are all at risk. The impacts of climate change are not only devastating, but unfortunately quite discriminating. And it's like COVID-19 in a way, climate change, as the hardest hit are the poor, the most fragile, the very folks who are least positioned to bounce back. And so now all that is very doom and gloom, but I said I'm hopeful, which is because of these new innovations, these creative solutions that are being developed and deployed by dedicated entrepreneurs who have the character built into their beings, who are out there to break down the status quo and build businesses to tackle both issues of poverty and climate change simultaneously, doing so in a more equitable and sustainable way. At Acumen, we're finding hundreds of these business models across the clean energy and the agriculture sectors. Think about productive use energy solutions, solar irrigation pumps for farming practices, cold storage to save spoilage of agriculture products, energy systems, home systems, and systems for small businesses and hospitals that are not only enabling productivity, but also abating carbon production. And again, in the agriculture space, there are these enterprises that are both addressing the adaptation and mitigation needs, so models to help farmers adapt to climate change. An example is a greenhouse that sits on 1/10 of an acre of land, protecting from droughts and heavy rains, using 90% less water, increasing productivity by 7x, making these smallholder farmers more climate smart and minimizing the variability in income for smallholder farmers, which is one of the biggest challenges for a lot of the world's poor. And again, this regenerative ag thing, which is like my hot topic, these farming practices that sequester carbon by rebuilding the soil's organic matter and regenerating ultimately the health of soil. And I could give you hundreds of examples, but I only have about a minute left, I'm sure. But we also know that hundreds of social enterprise aren't enough to really break down the barriers and disrupt the cycles that keep folks impoverished or to alter the course of climate change. So the other piece that is wildly integral to building these long-term sustainable solutions to these very interconnected challenges is having the right kind of leadership, those willing to work across lines of difference from all cuts of society, those who are leading with the premise that all individuals matter and who see the earth as a key stakeholder. So we're talking community organizers and business owners, CEOs of large corporations, heads of institutions, government officials, because for far too long, our systems and institutions have really been working for just a few. And success has been ultimately measured by metrics of money, power, and fame. And we think that if we can change that to a framing where success is based on how the vulnerable are treated, into a mindset of giving back more than you take, and you pair that with a thriving business community that considers the poor and the earth as a stakeholder, that's when we see real change. And it's a tall order, of course, but what makes me hopeful is that we're seeing trends move in that direction, and that's what will make us all really good ancestors as well.
Eleanor, thank you so much. That's so exciting, that idea. I mean, I remember back from the 60s, the saying, think big and start small. And And you guys are actually making that a practice to change the world with those small measures at individual levels, and empowering people to make change for the better for the future. And it does bring in, the local, the economic, the climate, all of those things coming together, which is really, really beautiful to hear. So you are a very bright light in a dark time. So I want to thank you for that. And now I want to stretch it a little bit, because this sounds like it's all very much now and here and now and what's going on. But, take us out 100 years. What is your hope for these communities that you work with now?
Well, I love that. We do tend to take a long-term view. We know that as we continue to build these businesses and leaders across the globe, it's kind of this, as we build more and more, that's where we see the real impact, and that takes time. But I think the really exciting thing is that capital is flowing at unprecedented rates into solutions for the poor. Not enough, if you ask me, but there's a bigger flow of capital coming that way. Corporations are striving to be better global citizens, adapting this stakeholder model rather than shareholder models, some of them. There are real examples of moral leadership in governments, few, but across the globe, we are seeing some of that. And then a next generation of very active, vocal, up and coming leaders who have the gumption to break down the status quo. So 100 years out, it's a locally rooted, globally connected ecosystem made up of individuals, businesses, and governments that are all basing their actions on our shared humanity.
Well, that is spectacular. Thank you. Hope we'll get there. We will be back with you after the other talks, bringing you back on a panel. But for right now, I'm just going to turn this back over to Kim. Kim?
Thanks, George. Like the handoff. So let's see. Our next presenter is Steve Wardell, who is a mastermind who tracks digital health. And he knows more about this sector than anybody ought to know. He's just totally immersed in it. He wrote a book called The Future of Digital Health. He has a consulting firm for digital health companies known as Wardell Advisors. He tracks technology's disruption on care delivery channels, payers' roles, patient empowerment, and more. Steve also is a thought leader in producing events. He founded the Boston chapter of Health 2.0. He's also a member of the Founders Circle of Long Lab Boston. You can reach him on Twitter at Stephen Wardell. And Steve, let's take a look at his video. Gary, could you roll it, please?
Hello, I'm Steve Wardell, and I produce thought leadership events at the intersection of health tech and capital markets. I also run a consulting business in the healthcare innovation economy. I help healthcare CEOs boost growth and raise money from the right group of investors. And I'm the author of The Future of Digital Health. So I'm very excited about the future, and I believe the 21st century is going to be the age of healthcare. We're going to understand the basis for disease, and we're going to be able to solve disease like it's an engineering problem. When you look at certain trends, it's astonishing how these trends, often they're technologically driven, often they're take advantage of the information and technological economies of scale. And so healthcare is the world's most information intensive and centric industry. So if you thought that movies were information centric, it could be digitized and that would disrupt the movie business, healthcare is more so. It's more information centric. And it's a much bigger industry. It's the world's biggest industry. It's the most information-centric industry. It's the industry where software can make the biggest difference. It's where software has made the least impact so far and has the farthest to go during our lifetimes, just following other industries. But we don't have to pioneer and trailblaze. We can just model what the impact software has made in other industries. So I'm very optimistic. And you look at, there's trends that famously Raymond Kurzweil has pointed to, which show an exponential growth in the price performance of technology over time. And when you look at that, you look at certain times like World War II, or the great stock market crash of 1987, or the Great Recession of 2008 to 9. And these do not negatively impact that trend at all. They have no negative impact on that trend. So when we are caught up in crises, legitimate crises today that seem to point indicators negatively for the future, we should just be aware of this trend, and ultimately that trend of the price performance of technology in our lives, which is always exponential, is actually exponential and trending up on an exponential basis. So it's accelerating. And this is overwhelmingly good. It is disruptive in our lives. It does have there's the buggy whip phenomenon of solving a bigger problem, leading to people having to adapt to catch up. Well, overall, I'm positive and optimistic about what this means for our future.
Thank you. I'm optimistic and positive too when I hear somebody like you talk like that. It's hard to keep up. You speak so many words in such a short period of time. And welcome, Steve. Been wanting to get you on the stage for a long time, so please take it away.
Well, thank you. So I'm excited to talk about my favorite subjects, healthcare, the future, and we'll also bring in COVID. And because this is the Long Now Boston, we'll talk about sort of the healthcare endgame, the transformation of healthcare, the long-term future of healthcare. So a lot of people have been referring to this ongoing COVID crisis as a great reset. Society, the world is facing a great reset. I think in healthcare, a better term might be a great quickening. We're seeing in healthcare, we're seeing obstacles that were in the way of progress in healthcare be cleared away. We're seeing processes that were ongoing in healthcare toward the adoption of technology that would lead to better, cheaper, faster, more affordable, more accessible healthcare. Those processes are speeding up. We're seeing change, mostly positive change in healthcare. And so I think we can view COVID as a shock that could be called the great quickening in healthcare. So the trends I'd like to focus on right now are behavior change trends. So we're seeing things that we never thought we'd see this rapidly in healthcare. First, I'll focus on consumers and patients. So in consumers and patients, we saw the young were changing toward more healthcare, toward consuming healthcare technology, and toward the digitization of healthcare, and toward telemedicine, for example. But the young don't consume a lot of healthcare. And what we've seen with COVID is COVID has put a real infection control problem in the middle of every medical practice in every hospital. And this has led to massive telehealth adoption across all age groups. So we're seeing real behavior change. It's very hard to bring about. Consumers and patients tend to be conservative about how they go and see and behave with respect to healthcare. But they have changed for COVID, and probably there's no going back from this point. So now people expect to get their healthcare from their phone, and they're often happy with the results. And so we'll see more of a fusion in the future when the infection barriers from COVID come down. But this is a real jumpstart to quickening for consumers adopting digital healthcare and changing. So then there's regulators. Regulators have responded very positively to the multiple crises of COVID. So just in some examples, regulators have sought to broaden the use and applicability of technology across healthcare to meet a lot of the crises and changes that we faced due to COVID. And regulators have even also made for more rapid approval of novel digital therapeutics for people with behavioral health issues at home, for example. So those are some. So I think we're living in a golden age of the regulatory treatment of healthcare. The next actor in healthcare is the payer, such as the employer or the managed care organization. And here we've also seen change that we didn't think we'd see. So we're seeing payers, for example, agree to pricing equivalence. This is really important for doctors, but if you're going to have a medical visit that's a telehealth visit, for example, you'd like for that not to be priced at less than a third of the price of an in-person visit. You'd like for it to be priced at about equivalency, and we've seen managed care organizations and government step up to do that. And also employers, they're a major payer, and employers are taking an attitude that they provide support and healthcare services for employees in an office environment. And post-COVID, when employees are working from home, they'd like to provide an equivalent level of support as well. And this often means offering digitized versions of products. So for example, If they supported employees with diabetes, with chronic care management programs in the office, they're likely to want to supply those kinds of programs with people who are working from home. And this may now be an app-based program to manage diabetes or hypertension or other chronic care conditions or provide wellness solutions. And so lastly, there's providers. And once again, providers, these are doctors and nurses, they are also known to be temperamentally conservative, to not want to change. Doctors also have a lot of clout in medicine. But doctors have changed as well. They've adopted behavior change. We're probably not going to go back after COVID. So they're seeing patients arrive to them virtually. They're seeing regulators support the change to virtual. They're seeing payers reimburse for virtual care. And so doctors are training themselves in digital care, and they are changing their workflows as well to create virtual practices, to practice medicine virtually. So doctors are on board as well. So those are the trends that we're seeing come out of COVID. That's the great quickening of COVID. So next, this is leading to the creation of a new care delivery models in healthcare. So the new care delivery models are often virtual care first models. So initially this is synchronous. So you already have a physician and you see that physician and their front door is now a virtual or digital front door, and you see them digitally. And then you may need to come in, but that's not going to be your first visit with them. Only if you really need to come in, will you come in for that in-person visit. That's how it starts off, but then it'll move from synchronous and video visits to asynchronous care, which potentially can make care a lot more accessible and affordable. So all kinds of virtual care. That's the first level. And then there's a new kind of call it the three horsemen of the new care delivery model, and that's remote monitoring, telehealth, and electronic medical records. So for electronic medical records, we're taking all healthcare data and we're putting it into EMRs. And then once it's in EMRs and structured fields, we can analyze it better. And then in order to provide care, we have to get that data back out of the EMR to make decisions with it. But EMRs have been growing for a while. They're now central to providing care. Then there's remote monitoring. This is very interesting, but we're going through a golden age of wearable devices, a golden age of sensors, new kinds of data, more continuous data, more affordable sensors, more instrumentation, and this can all be made remote. You can get a package from your physician and it can contain sensors that you use. It can contain a scale. It can contain a blood pressure monitor. It can contain a blood glucose monitor. It can contain clinical grade sensors that then give you data streams into your EMR that your physician can use in your care, so you don't have to come in. So instead of episodically presenting and recounting patient information to a physician and collecting data at the physician's site, now you have continuous data from new kinds of instruments that are worn on your body, that are with you conveniently in your home using remote monitoring. And then lastly, telehealth, so the physician can check in, they can look back on this better pile of data, and they can intervene in your care plan better when they evaluate this data. So remote monitoring, telehealth, and EMRs. So finally, where is this all going, the transformation of healthcare? So I think it's going towards more evidence-based medicine. It's about time we got to evidence-based medicine, and this will be supported by massive amounts of new data from new kinds of sensors. That is centralized, is put into central repositories where you can compare yourself to your prior self. You compare yourself to other people with your disease condition. You can have AI agents running on this, giving recommendations to physicians. And then we're also trending towards well care instead of sick care. So the healthcare system of America and the world has always been that you wait until you're sick and you present when you're sick to a physician, and then the system responds to your sickness. But instead, with all of this data and monitoring, we can actually intervene early. We can say, look, there's a growth here. We spotted it very early, and so we can act on it. We can diagnose it early, find out what's going on here. We can see someone's vitals are headed in a very bad direction. We can intervene before that turns into an emergency room visit. What's going on here? So well care, maintaining wellness instead of intervening after sickness has already occurred. The next is fee for value. This is a regulatory change.
Steve,
Oh, yeah.
I'm going to slow you down here and see if you can wrap up in about, 30 seconds.
Sure, that's great. Yeah, I was at the end. But a shift toward fee for value instead of the traditional fee for service is also going to create a great opening for technology and software in the shift to fee for value.
And lastly, patient empowerment. So patients are going to have more choices than ever. They're going to be empowered by data more than ever before. It's going to be, so patients are going to be able to sort of seize on this wealth of information and the options it gives them for patient empowerment in the future. So that's the transformation of healthcare. So that's it. Thanks.
You're welcome. Thank you. I've got a lot of questions, man. I just don't know where to start. I guess the biggest one has to do with the EMRs and the sensors, the AI, all of that stuff. And it's a pretty good question about, it really has to do with the centralization of records in this country. I don't know how much you're tracking in around the world, but this country, it's just such a mess. There's so much redundancy and so much that's unknown. And I mean, I went to the doctor the other day, they had me fill out things on a sheet of paper, and Lord knows where that sheet of paper went or who copied it. So, and I go to another doctor, of course, they don't have access to those records. Any optimism or any kind of idea when you might see a tipping point on that?
So really good question. Of course, so healthcare, partly driven by that fee-for-service model the old fee-for-service model of healthcare, has not been a good customer of technology in general. But I think that we are seeing, so I think that COVID has been a shock that's going to lead to a better use of this centralization of data in healthcare. So you'll see data collected more electronically in the future, and that's partly for infection control reasons. You'll see more decentralized workers in healthcare, so they'll need to access that data digitally. They won't be able to go to a filing cabinet to get the data, etc. So I think all the trends are converging that even though this has been a problem in healthcare for a long time, it really is changing now. So at the same time, I could also point to some counter issues, which is that in general, healthcare institutions, they like to be selfish about their data. They don't like to share their data. And sometimes that's for good cause, but other times it's because the data is actually the key to them getting and retaining the business of their existing patients as well. So you might need and Congress has occasionally sought to sort of prod the healthcare system to do the right thing with data. There's also very, very serious and important issues around privacy and security of data as well. And so if you make it very shareable, then you actually create problems that have to be solved later of keeping data, getting it always to the people who need it and never to the people who aren't supposed to have it. So.
Yeah. Well, the whole security piece and sharing information, I think, is pretty serious, and I think there are probably ways around that too. There are a lot of questions that are coming in for everyone, and I'm going to turn it back to George so we can bring Amelia in, have her wrap, and then we'll bring everybody back in for a panel. George?
All right, thank you, Kim. Our last and final Flash talker tonight is Amelia Jaworski. Amelia is an MD, entrepreneur, and researcher focused on the invention, development, and commercialization of new medical therapies. She's an advocate for the beneficial use of emerging technologies at the Future of Life Institute and Scientists Against Inhumane Weapons. She co-founded a skin health company, which was acquired in 2020, and is currently involved in early stage life science ventures. Amelia also spoke to Long Now Boston in February 2018, along with Dan Borelli in the program Chasing Color. So let's hear Amelia's introductory video.
Hi, I'm Amelia Jaworski, and I'm a physician scientist who works in medical innovation, which means in my day-to-day, I work on trying to get promising science off of the lab bench and into the clinic. I strongly believe that as scientists, or really as anyone working to create something new, a new product, a new technology, that we're not amoral agents. We cannot create something new and then abdicate responsibility for how it's used. Being in the business of creating something new in society, I believe we're fundamentally also in the business of ensuring that it's used in a way that is ethical and fair and ultimately benefits humanity. This belief is what motivated me to join the Future of Life Institute, which is a nonprofit founded on the mission of ensuring the long-term flourishing of humanity by working to mitigate potentially catastrophic risks posed by emerging technologies. So areas of focus that we look at are artificial intelligence, nuclear weapons, climate change, and biotechnology. My area of focus personally at the Institute is on the topic of lethal autonomous weapons. These are weapon systems that would employ artificial intelligence to selectively identify, select, and target, meaning kill humans without human control. Now, this is an issue that I care deeply about, not only because of the fundamental moral question of whether we as a human society want to delegate the decision to take a life and whose life to algorithms, but this is also an issue that represents a first test of our global community's ability to draw a red line on unacceptable use cases of artificial intelligence and avoid some of the most dangerous and destabilizing use cases of AI. We work with technologists and policymakers and the public alike to help sensitize them to these risks with the hope of getting some sort of global cooperation and setting a precedent about what governance of AI could look like, and ultimately a precedent of how can we govern technology and deploy technology, powerful technology with wisdom. So I'm Amelia Jaworski, and I am doing my best to be a good ancestor.
All right, thank you, Amelia. So welcome. It's great to have you back on the Long Island Boston podium. It's good to see you again. So your work cuts across a broad spectrum of scientific and business dimensions. So interested to know what insights you'd like to share with us tonight about societal challenge and resilience.
Thank you so much, George. It's great to be back. And given my background as a medical researcher, it seemed only appropriate to reflect on the topic of societal resilience through the lens of the current pandemic. And so hopefully some of the things I mentioned tonight will be a bit of an appetizer for the event to come in February. Because I think there's quite a bit of lessons to be learned from this pandemic for our resilience for threats that are of similar nature that we're almost certain to face in the future. And in the spirit of tonight's event, I don't think that's all gloom and doom. So one lesson I think that we've learned is about the value of having a robust scientific infrastructure in our society. You know, as we sit here tonight in the US, we have not one, but two safe and effective vaccines that have been approved for use, with efficacy data that's pretty much as good as you get in terms of gold standards of a vaccine. And this was not accomplished in decades. This was accomplished in a matter of months. And I think it's worth reflecting on how did we get here? And a lot of the prevailing narrative around the story was this was a concerted effort to do science at quote unquote warp speed, which I think is not only a terrible name for building trust in the product, but that it also does a deep disservice for the decades of research and scientific infrastructure that really enabled this to happen. So when you think about it on the virus side, the ability to design a vaccine against a novel coronavirus was in part due to the decades of intense study around coronaviruses that was partially motivated by basically these relative near misses that we had with SARS and with MERS. And so scientists knew from those experiences that this family of viruses was a high degree of potential to basically spawn a new pandemic. And then when you look on the technology side of the mRNA platform that was used for these two initial viruses, this was built on decades of basic science research into the therapeutic potential of mRNA. And this was done, for 20 plus years on the lab bench, followed by another decade of commercialization and translation efforts in companies like BioNTech and Moderna. And all along, we knew that mRNA had, theoretically, really high value as a potential therapeutic, but nobody quite knew exactly what that initial killer application was going to be in terms of commercial success for the technology. And so I think a first lesson is basically the value of developing a robust scientific infrastructure to support basic fundamental scientific inquiry, and also investment in these high risk, high reward projects that may not necessarily have an obvious near-term application. And in the case of our vaccines, this ability for us to go really fast now in the present was built on decades and enabled by decades of slow, meticulous scientific progress. I think a second lesson we've learned is, and this is maybe a little less optimistic one, is that the timescales that our society is capable of planning for are woefully shorter than I think many of us had previously imagined. Here at the Long Now, we think about the very long-term future. And this year we were hit with the hard reality that society is pretty ill-equipped to take on challenges on the orders of weeks to months. And I think it's my hope that after experiencing the failures of that kind of thinking and that model, this will be a little bit of a wake-up call of illustrating the value to people of planning and thinking beyond the present, and stimulate a greater openness for us to think about the future. And I'd argue that that's really the key step, that a bottleneck is untethering people from just thinking in terms of the present to enable them to conceptualize and value thinking about the future. And then a natural progression from there is, what is the magnitude of the future you're thinking about? And finally, a lesson that we've learned is that high impact, low probability events do happen. As someone who cares a lot about global catastrophic risk, I'm hoping that the recency and the magnitude of this experience will help to sensitize and motivate people to act on the mitigation of tail risks and invest in making our society more robust and better prepared for these sorts of destabilizing events, with the hope of preventing them altogether. And I think this extends beyond just thinking about pandemics and pandemic preparedness. I think there's an opportunity here to use this experience of COVID to motivate action on risks with similar profiles. When we think about things like the climate emergency or nuclear disarmament or AI safety, I think there's an ability to harness the recency bias sort of what we're experiencing now and extrapolate that to other risks that are faced by society. So in conclusion, some lessons I hope that we've learned are the value of supporting fundamental science, working to awaken people from timescales that extend beyond the present, and understanding that very bad things that are low probability can happen, and we must prepare for them. And for me, these are some of the key takeaways for what we can learn from and sort of see a silver lining in this pandemic to help us flourish and meet the challenges of the future.
Amelia, thank you. That was awesome. I'm reminded of the basic advice that we all learn from our painful experiences, and so COVID is an important lesson for us as a society to learn, and hopefully we can learn those lessons here so we don't have to learn them on issues that are, the other things that you like to worry about or don't like to worry about. But thank you very much. That was great. We're going to bring the four speakers now together for a panel conversation. But as Gary brings them up on the screen, we're going to do a spotlighting thing, bring people up on the screen. I'd like to open with a question for you, Amelia. First, thank you for your dedication and enthusiasm. It's great that you can be so cheerful while being immersed in the challenges of existential risk. That's quite a contrast to the dystopian stories we hear in popular culture. Given the strong negative messaging that we get about the bad future that's coming down the pike, what's your response to those like me who are worried about the future for our grandchildren and their grandchildren?
Yeah. So I think you're right to be worried. I don't think the worry is unjustified. But at least the way I like to see it is what we're in is in a race sort of between the power of the technology we develop and the wisdom with which we deploy that technology. So we hear a lot about power and the power of technology. And a lot of those dystopian visions basically show what happens when you don't use that power and harness that power wisely. I think there's tremendous opportunity to cultivate on sort of the wisdom side of the equation, that the same kinds of things that have the potential to destroy us are also the same, could be flipped to be the things that help us to flourish and advance and have a very long-term future, become a multi-planetary species. You know, this idea that you brought up of deep time going forward, right? So I do think that there's definitely, those risks are real, but the converse side of those is if we harness the technology we're developing with wisdom, we can hopefully avoid some of those outcomes and look towards a future that's much more hopeful and brighter for humanity. So I remain an optimist despite being in the world of risk.
Great, thank you, Amelia. That's a great answer. I think it's probably good to start with an opportunity for the four of you to make a question, offer a question or observation to one of your co-panelists. I don't know if any of you have anything that, as you heard this, just popped into your head and you'd like to take a crack at it. I know we've got some questions coming in from the chat room, and Gary and Kim are taking a look at those. So, all right, Steve. Go ahead.
Steve, go ahead.
So Amelia, I'm fascinated by your topic, the topic of the killer robots. And so I'm just wondering, seems like you somehow have created what to me seems like a very obvious bright red line. Do not cross this line. You know, don't create robots that autonomously kill. What kind of receptive audience have you got to this? Do you talk to people who make these decisions and they say, that's completely obvious, yes, we're going to follow that rule? Or have you found that there's no one to talk to, or that they don't want to listen to you, or what have you found?
So you would think it would be obvious. That's part of the reason that, you know, this issue is important to us, both as an issue in and of itself, but for the broader landscape of what kind of job are we going to do as a human society, and being able to draw a red line anywhere, right? So starting with an obvious use case felt like a good place to start. There are ongoing international discussions within the UN ecosystem on this, mainly happening in Geneva. And as far as they've been able to get right now is principles. So there is a strong contingency of countries who do want to develop these systems. And so it's not clear that we'll be able to actually draw that line, but there's definitely a concerted effort and dialogue happening trying to do that via a multilateralism kind of approach.
So, America has kind of traditional adversaries, maybe, and you might view Russia as one of them. So would you automatically expect Russia to take the same view, don't do this, or would you expect these other countries to take the opposite view? Yeah, we're going to do it because we need to do it to win, or something like that?
Yeah, I think that there's a certain contingency of countries that think this is because of that kind of thinking, right? This idea of, whether it be US-Russia axis, US-China axis, there's a few other countries peppered in that do not want to be prohibited from making any sort of particular technology relative to the military. So a lot of the conversation has moved away from prohibitions and more to the idea of a positive obligation of meaningful human control, right? So we won't ban any specific embodiments, but we'll commit to this principle of human control. And that seems to be getting a little bit more in terms of feet and legs. But I know these conversations are nothing new, where we have in previous disarmament efforts been able to get agreement between superpowers that seemed adversarial. Some of our greatest treaties came at the height of sort of an arms race dynamic. So I don't think it's impossible. I think there's historical precedent for it. But I think it connects to a lot of the topics discussed here more broadly, is like, what is the appetite in general now for global cooperation on issues? And so I'd be interested to hear from the other panelists how you kind of see the global dimension to the work that you're doing.
I think one of my main concerns about global change issues, and certainly there are a lot of international discussions going on at the UN, at WHO from the health perspective and so on, is the phenomenon that we've witnessed in this country of the politicization of science, to the extent that we have this pandemic that has killed more than 300,000 people in this country alone. And yet people are staring that in the face and saying it doesn't exist, it's a hoax. And there are many people in the global change, sustainable world who are looking at this and saying this pandemic should be a lesson for us about planetary functions and things that happen on a global scale. And I wonder what you see as the possibility for it actually being a positive lesson, as opposed to an example of how things are staring us in the face. We know what helps cut down transmission. We want to halt until we can get the vaccines out there. But what about science denial? And what about the politicization of science, especially when it involves major corporate interests that range all the way from healthcare to fossil fuel interests?
And also something else in there too about moral leadership, which has been touched on, especially in elected officials. But I don't want to get into a whole politics thing, but the whole moral guidance piece is part of that too.
I'm happy to touch on science denial, but Eleanor, I'd be interested in your thought about the intersectionality component of all this.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I was just reflecting as you both were speaking, and I think, I mean, from our perspective, we are a global organization, and we are working in, the majority of our work is done internationally. And I think the interesting thing that we've seen, I mean, some of the themes that are coming up, I'm seeing like principles and being really rooted in principles and resilience and behavior change, but all rooted at the core of this like mindfulness human component. And that, of course, I think cuts across all of the work that all of us are doing. But I think what's fascinating to see working across the globe is how we are borrowing and I think replicating some of the technologies when it comes to poverty alleviation from the developing world to the developed world. And so how we're actually being able to look to them as the best use cases for issues of poverty here in the US, where there are developed markets and there is a robust ecosystem of, you know, innovation and social entrepreneurship, but how we just still haven't solved all those problems. So I think that's the angle that I come at it from. I don't know, yeah, if there's more to add there. I mean, Joe, I think, yeah, I'll pause there for a minute and see if anybody else has anything to add on that component.
Well, what I find is looking at the local level, I can be a lot more positive than looking at the national or global levels, because I know I work with a number of organizations that operate on local levels. One is in Cambridge called Ecologic, that works with small villages in Central America and Mexico. And another is called Mil Milagros, which works primarily with communities around Lake Atitlan in Guatemala. And they are doing transformational things in terms of combining largely empowerment of women within their communities and sustainable agriculture and cutting down on both fossil fuel and wood fuel use by designing new stoves that let them cook efficiently while keeping the indoor air in their houses cleaner. There's a lot of that kind of stuff going on. And I wonder if some of you that have been working with larger intergovernmental organizations see that kind of movement on national and international levels.
And I'll just jump in there, because I think that there's the disparity between those very local oriented solutions that, you know, take time to scale. And, you know, if you're going to do it, let's get to scale, right? Let's reach the breadth, because if we're not doing that, then are we really changing systems and really having the impact we want? And there's this long story that I won't tell about an ambulance company that we supported almost 15 years ago that started with 9 ambulances, and investors looked at us like we were crazy to invest in an organization that was going to provide ambulatory services to the poorest people in India. And today is the 6th largest ambulance company in the world, partnered with the government across India, across 10 states, and is, you know, servicing millions literally on a daily basis. So I think and that's a shining example, of course, right? There's lots of failure that leads to that. But I do think there's this unique opportunity for local oriented solutions to really be the kind of the beacon for how some of the governments and larger institutions, even multilaterals, approach some of these big problems.
We have a question here from the audience, which I'll throw out, and it's to Steve, I think. I'm going to combine it with a couple of others. And Michelle Monty asks, does the shift to evidence-based medicine and being more data provided by individuals through their devices versus traditional methods of getting evidence through limited studies? And is that going to help the population have more faith in the medical system? That's a tough one. And Mary also is wondering about, there's a lot coming down the pipeline on personalized medicine, which is really good for precision, but what does that, how does that fracture the idea of public health as a group concept?
That's great. Well, so I do think that transparency and more data, does have the opportunity to rebuild faith in the healthcare system. And I'll just give two examples of that. One would be, you might have widespread sort of phase 4 surveillance of a population that has had medical intervention, and this can give us insights into how safe that medical intervention is and what to avoid, maybe not in the elderly, maybe don't combine it with alcohol. We can learn these things over time. We can improve drugs more rapidly, and then we can learn about them in the surveillance phase. And we have a lot more data to do that with, and that data will be collected, frictionlessly, and will be sent to a central repository where we can evaluate these things. So that'll be good. And then the second example I would just use is that your healthcare provider, in your particular case, gives you a home blood pressure monitor that's very convenient and that's FDA cleared, and that is connected to the network, and that data goes straight into your EMR. It's not, you don't print it out and bring it in to your doctor and have your doctor to look at it, and the doctor doesn't know whether to trust it. And then in that healthcare system, they have workflows to know how to deal with this and how to remind the doctor just in time to look at it before the doctor takes a look at you or something. And so this will, and so both of these, whether we're talking about population surveillance scenarios, or whether you're talking about your specific provider for your specific situation, I think those are scenarios of the future, the not too distant future, that will help to boost faith, if it needs it, in the healthcare system.
It almost sounds like we're becoming part of the Internet of Things.
Yes. Also, and I'm optimistic about that, but we do have to address the Internet of Things is also famously poor at security, and when it comes to healthcare, you really want the IT security to be there. In fact, there's a grim gallows humor joke I'll share, which is, it goes like this: says there's two phases to the modernization of Americans' health records. In the first phase, they take all of your personal, private, confidential health information and they digitize it and put it in the cloud. And in the second phase, you get a free backup in China. So let's hope not.
Let's see. I'm sorry, please.
I just wanted to cycle back to one of the issues that came up, and we've circled around it, and that is what seems to be a problem with the credibility of science and the ability of people to look at science with the eye that we had when I was a kid. I mean, it was the answer to everything, and it was true. And today there seems to be something quite different. And it's ironic that here we are at the end stage now with the vaccine coming in for COVID, which is totally based on science. I mean, it is science-based, and it's effective, and it works, and basically science works. We know that. And yet there's this undercurrent of resistance to it or denial to it. And that resistance is also fundamentally propelled or exacerbated by the technologies of information and social media. So what can we do to try and increase the credibility of science and the ability of people to trust it?
I can try and take a first stab at that, George. I think that's not just true of the general population, that's true of the population at large. So part of the reason I got involved in this particular issue of lethal autonomous weapons is historically in sort of disarmament conversations, the physician community and scientific community played a really key role in advancing a lot of disarmament work. When you look at the International Physicians Against Prevention of Nuclear War, or the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, and had a lot of sway and helped to change some of those conversations to steer them in the right direction. And what we see with some of these newer issues is that is not necessarily the case in terms of being able to have that same kind of influence on policymakers. It's certainly, and I think that becomes a vicious cycle where scientists become less engaged because they feel that their day jobs, they can make more progress there than not be heard, right? So I think there's part of it that's a vicious cycle, and starting to break that is getting scientists more involved in communication and advocacy, and like taking that on, and also supplying them with the training so they can do that effectively and like be effective communicators about, kind of what they do. I think another aspect of it, this is total anecdotal, but is seeing how we make science experts. And I think that the word expert has actually taken on a bad connotation, because in a world where we live of income inequality and really strong class tensions, it makes people feel like this is someone from, a demographic that doesn't understand me. I think a better way to talk about it, and there's going to be some changing of the language of how we think about scientists, is like, this is what these people do every day, right? And so it's the same reason you wouldn't go, to your friend who's a dentist to fix your car, who's a car mechanic, right? You want to go to the person who does that every single day and lives that and knows that craft, that knowledge, that space. I think another part, besides scientists getting more engaged in communication, is also changing the language around what is expertise actually, and not making it such a classist thing, but more of a sort of experientially based and practice-based and expertise that's crafted from what you do in your day-to-day. I don't know, Joe, do you have anything in terms of being in this?
Funny you should ask. My own personal approach to trying to do what I can for the situation is obviously to approach education at the secondary school level. Because, for example, in most sciences, people who are not going to be scientists or doctors, the last time they look at biology, chemistry, and physics, if they look at it at all, is in high school. And so we try in our program to really get across and reinforce the nature of science. What is it that scientists do every day? They don't pull things out of a hat. They don't say, I think this is what happens. They use data and analysis and replication and so on and so forth. I think the problem is that one of the reasons I started doing what I am now doing is that back in the 80s, I was thinking exactly what you just said, that scientists have to get more engaged, that we can't depend on journalists who like science exclusively to bring this stuff to the public, that we have to encourage scientists themselves to talk directly to people. And that there has been a wave of that. I have several friends who are doing that in a wide variety of different ways, and colleagues who are not really close friends who are doing it even greater. Michael Mann with the climate change stuff. A friend, Mark Plotkin, who's doing it with indigenous knowledge in Amazonian plants and the value of that pharmacopoeia to the world, not just because we want to save a place for sloths to climb from tree to tree, but because those plants and animals have a lot of information that basic science can turn to improving the human condition. And the difficulty is that over the last 4 years, we've seen almost every major scientific institution at the national level in this country be disemboweled and silenced. And if it wasn't for Fauci, I don't know where we'd be in terms of coronavirus. But the EPA and all the other organizations that have historically taken this information, digested it, combined it with input from other stakeholders, because obviously science alone can't make major socio-political economic decisions. Scientists provide data about scientific phenomena, and then we have the economists and everybody else weigh in. And do we use regulation or do we use incentives? But what I've seen here and what my colleagues are tearing what little hair we have left out about, is the disempowerment of scientists at the highest levels that consult with government. And I don't know, I'm trying to be positive, and I do know that more and more and more real scientists are developing the tools necessary to communicate with the public. And the question is, will that information be utilized by people who are in elected offices?
Yeah. And one point I would add to that, Joe, at least some things that I've struggled with in trying to do science communication, is there's this fundamental tension of like science speaks the language of uncertainty, right? Like when I go before on the business side, an investor or communicating research, like people want to hear you say something that's a definitive, right? And the language of science and the practice of science, it doesn't work like that. It's not certainty, right? And I think it's really hard when you're speaking the language of uncertainty and you're competing on social media or other avenues with people who are willing to paint science as a certain art, right? And we've seen that throughout this pandemic where people said, oh, things keep changing. And it's like, well, they're not changing. We're just learning more things and collapsing that, probability function one way or another. So I don't know what the answer to that is, but that's something just I've struggled with on that front.
I just wanted to add something because I think as we talk about data a lot with the work that we do about understanding the needs of the poor and collecting data points. And I think something that's really important too is to just remind people that data is human centric, right? It's all about human interaction, human touch points, experiences. And I think the framing of data and the analysis of data in science in that way is really important, because I think if we just talk in the numbers and the algorithms, it can get lost. But data is essentially human touch points, right? In so many ways, again, especially with the work that we're doing, but reframing it in that way, I think is important and helpful to kind of combat, George, some of what you were posing in your question.
I'm going to cut this off now. And it is great. And I'm just going to say that the wonderful thing about science is all we just keep doing is making mistakes and keep seeing what the next thing is. But I'm going to thank you all so much. This has been wonderful. You made it so easy for us because you kept asking each other questions. And I'm going to give you a big hands up. And I'm going to throw it back to Jennifer, who's going to close us out. And before we do that, I just want to remind everybody to take the elevator downstairs to the lobby bar, and this conversation will continue. Continue to be moderated, but not as tightly. So, Jennifer?
Thank you, Kim. And thank you, George, too. And thanks to all our speakers. It was just really terrific. I just feel like we could talk about this all night. I just wanted to thank everybody for joining us tonight. And I hope you found this conversation as rewarding as I did. I don't want to forget to remind you to check for our event in February, to sign up on Eventbrite. Remember to visit, there it is right there. That also promises to be a terrific conversation. Please remember to visit our website, check us out on social media. Please be in touch if you'd like to become a member or would like to help out. We got the information there, longnowboston.org or at longnowboston. And as Kim mentioned, we will be moving to a more informal conversation for those of you who would like to stay with us a little bit longer. George will be kicking that off. But for the rest of you who may not be sticking around, please stay well. Good night, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.
All right, great, Jennifer. Thank you. For those of you that want to stick around, this is an opportunity to try and open up the conversation a bit. Kim and I are switching to gallery view, so I think we can, try and see everybody that's up there. And what we're going to do is just,
George, I know
yes.
that there was a question that was hanging out there from Mark and Pam Howell, if they're still on. Mark, Pam, if you want to throw that question out now, is a good time to do it, if you're still on.
Yeah, we are here. Thanks, Kim. So it occurred to me while you guys were all talking that you each mentioned governments and businesses as sort of institutional components of the areas that you're working in. And, Pam, as many of you know her, works in religious institutions. But what occurred to us was a kind of a question around, are those really the best institutional structures to promote the kind of work that you're trying to do? Or do we actually, on the time scales that we're talking about, need different or better institutions or institutional motivations that are somewhat different than what we are used to finding in governmental and commercial enterprises? And I just thought I'd prompt you to maybe reflect along those lines.
Eleanor, I think that's probably one of the places where your organization might work the most. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. It's really you've got me thinking a little bit about how to best address it. But I think, I think the reality is that we know that institutions, right, the governments and businesses and large corporates and multilaterals are built within structures that have been existing for a long, for the very long term. And, the reality of today is in many ways similar, but in many ways quite different. And so I was just thinking about, from like a local perspective, the kinds of institutions that we can engage with. And so, I think about these smaller communities in, rural parts of Colombia or northern Nigeria, or, you name it, where Acumen is working. And the institutions we're looking to are it's kind of like the social fabric, and I would say informal institutions that we're looking to really help deploy some of the, I think, the methodologies, the principles, the values that we're trying to instill at that level, but then also to take them up to the business world as well as the larger government world. And so the work around changing institutions starts with individuals from our perspective. And so we have at Acumen, we have a kind of a whole philosophy around how to, and a whole practice around how to engage with individuals who can then take this practice through institutions, governments, and business. And over time, again, this is a long-term play, that if you engage with enough of those people who are then bringing these kind of practices into those existing institutions while engaging with the local institutions, you can see real change. But religion is a really big part of the work we do, in the framing that we're looking to work across, religious factions in India and Pakistan and parts of East and West Africa, where there's religion and tribal lines of difference. And so the institutions that hold those differences are really important to work with and engage with. But again, I think it starts from like the individual perspective, from where we're coming at, to kind of, to reshape and reshift how the institutions themselves work and engage with community and others.
Joe, are you seeing anything along those lines, the communities that you're working with? Unmute, please.
Yes, I have a couple of stories I can tell. One is some information from Ecologic, which works in Guatemala, and they work with indigenous communities. And one of their great successes is in a community in an area called Totonicapan, which had been surrounded by a high altitude tropical pine forest. And the problem from an ecological perspective about pine trees is they grow straight and tall and the wood is strong. So it's a primary target for logging, for industrial and residential building and so on and so forth. And what Ecologic found was that the local Mayan cosmology held water as sacred. And so working within that cosmology, the people had noticed that all the springs on which their livelihood depended were drying up as the forest was disappearing. And Ecologic was able to come in with actual science, but tailoring it to that worldview and saying the trees help the water stay. So if we replant trees, you'll get your water back. And so you then had not people from outside coming in and saying, what you need to do is plant trees and you need to do it this way and so on. That galvanized the villagers into forming their own park guards to guard against illegal logging. And they established widespread nurseries that are now raising thousands of trees and planting them out where they used to grow. So that's a good example of positively harnessing a religious tradition in the service of community betterment and ecological restoration. In this country, the example is more fraught, but for example, a lot of the evangelical Christian community has typically, historically, been arrayed against a lot of ecology and, eco-restoration and regulation and so on and so forth. And there are an increasingly large number of scientists who happen to be evangelical Christians who are taking their science and their insider's view of that faith community and saying, look, what about the messages about creation care that are found in our scriptures and commentaries on those scriptures? One very important person who's doing that is a climate scientist named Catherine Hayhoe. I hope I'm pronouncing her last name correctly. She is an evangelical Christian and is addressing issues of climate change directly with her community in language and in frameworks that they can appreciate and accept positively, rather than taking them. For example, if I went to try and talk to them, they probably think, oh, here's this New York Jew and he's just talking down to us. He's a member of the elite and all this kind of stuff. So I think in some cases it's important to try and harness the strength and the community fabric of religious traditions, and it just has to be done in an informed, socially responsible, equitable way.
Maybe another question to add to that is the institutions, whether we're talking about government, business, or different types of institutions. How do you look at the incentives that those institutions have, and try and modify those incentives in a way that brings them more in alignment with the communities and the populations that they serve? And one of the ones in the climate area would be carbon pricing, and so making it a good business to avoid polluting with carbon. So are there things that you could look at as ways of incentivizing the institutions that we already have to be more in alignment with the interests that we want them to serve?
Well, I think there's a couple things there, right? Like if we look at SDG 7, right? It's the potentially most achievable SDG, energy access for all. And we have the solutions, right? We know that extending the grid to every poor rural last mile community is going to cost billions and billions and take 60 or 70 years. But we have these renewable, clean, distributable energy sources and technologies at our whim. And so aligning government, if we're thinking about government in those institutions, with these market-based solutions that we know have real potential impact and real capacity to help us achieve those the big goals, the SDGs, and aligning them is, even when these governments come out and these ministers come out and say we have, it's energy access is what we're striving for every individual within X country, wherever they're, wherever we're talking about. And I think it's a great hope, George, and I think it's something that we're certainly working towards, is how do you take examples from what works in these kinds of market-based solutions, and how do you leverage that success to engage with government and larger institutions who have the leverage and have the influence and have the power to actually do it? I don't know what the answer is. We've seen some successes within the work that Acumen's done. We've worked with the government of Rwanda, the government of Kenya, again, in the energy access space. But it's behavior change, and I think aligning incentives is really interesting when there are, a number of competing incentives for a number of these institutions.
Anybody else want to chime in? Yeah, anyone? There you go, Cam.
Anyone? Well, I guess that's about it. It is about time. So I think it's been last round. Thanks everyone again.